All right. Welcome to our POC meeting. Let me think I'll start sharing. But Daniel, I think you are the first one on the topic agenda. Can you talk about the Envoy filter?
Yeah, so last TOC meeting, there was a request to make sure we document the release notes. I didn't get a blurb approved in time to include in the release notes. We can go after the fact and add it. But Craig Bach seemed to kind of recommend not doing it that way and doing a blog. So wanted to bring it back to TOC and find out what direction we want to go with that and make sure that it doesn't fall through the cracks and not get done.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I guess my concern with that blog is who's going to have the bandwidth to write the blog.
I thought I already saw a draft blurb for the release notes. Was that not the case?
It was in one of our channel, I think, when Daniel asked about what's the message we can put in. I think Keith, you started something. I made it some minor change, and Mitch gave a thumbs up. Maybe Daniel was referring to we didn't get enough TOC member give the thumbs up, and Craig was emphasis let's not talk about it because nothing changed from 125 to 126.
Yeah, I made a post about it. It was definitely in Slack and didn't feel like I got a definitive like let's go with this entry.
Yeah, so if we were I guess we should decide what do we want to do now? Do we want to write the blog? I really don't think anybody would have wants to unless anybody wants to volunteer. I thought my initial thoughts is just add a call out. Maybe not on the what's new because it's not what's new. But maybe somewhere in here too.
Do we have a good docs page for users to read and
not for ambient? That's a good point. Last time we look at the ambient doc, I think we are good at talking about what's supported, what's not supported. Maybe that's the page we should think about creating.
I'm not even sure we're good at talking about what's supported in the docs. There's a blog post where we talk about what's supported, but the blog is not the most discoverable location for that information. I have asked, well, Keith and I have started talking to a few Microsoft team members about clarifying that in our docs. But I wouldn't want to block this Envoy filter work just on that larger initiative.
Yes, that is a much larger initiative.
My point is, it's not so large. I mean, everything that we have should be documented in the site. I mean, if it's a feature that is supported or not supported, and blogs are, kind of quick announcements that are ephemeral, not necessarily I mean, wonderful. Blog or not blog, everyone can blog about whatever they want, or I don't know, blue sky or whatever they are doing. But what's important is for users and the LLMs to find the page where the doc is created.
Yeah, I'm looking at the layer 7 features. I mean, we have what's supported. What we don't have is what's not supported on the API surface, right? Like we say, WASM is alpha, these are beta. I think what's missing is Envoy filter is not supported, and I almost feel like an immediate small action we can do is add Envoy filter not supported on this page and then make a link to that page from the release announcement.
To be clear, it is supported in gateways just like it ever was. It's not supported in waypoints.
Right, that's a good clarification. Yes, and this particular page is about waypoint, which we could clarify that for Envoy filter. Yeah.
In waypoint, be very specific. Not ambient doesn't support Envoy
Yes.
filters. Ambient in waypoints, which is automatically configured things. And gateways can be used at any point the user wants something in place of waypoints with explicit configuration. Not.
Yes, I believe that's the message is Mitch, Keith, and I collaborated on Custom. I don't know if you saw.
No, when we add any wording, we need to be very clear. That was my point. I mean, because it's very ambiguous and very confusing when words we don't have the full context.
Yeah, let me paste the messages here. So just so if anybody wants to have any change, we can collaborate that. So sounds like two action we need, if I'm hearing correctly. Unless anybody is interested in writing the blog, we're leaning towards just write a warning message on the release notes and also update the docs for layer 7 features for Waypoint to mention Envoy filter is not supported for now for the Waypoint.
I can start a PR for that and then being TSC members to just double check it before we put it up.
That would be
That would
great.
be awesome. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Daniel. And thank you for going back and forth on this, working with Craig. Yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. So if there's no objection, we'll consider this is approved, this warning message. Thank you, Daniel, for that. Should we move to the next topic? Yes, docs are important too. So Daniel, if you have bandwidth with the docs, if not, let's open an issue to track that too. Clarify the docs for the layer 7 features.
I'm waiting on automation so I can have it done in about the next hour.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, very cool. Now let's move to the next topic, service scope with service setting hosts. Does anybody wants to drive the PR, take the screen sharing? I believe this is the PR that Jackie has been working with the community. I think we had a review on last Wednesday's work group meeting. So it would be great if we can drive some consensus on this PR. There's a lot of opinions on this. I actually read this morning briefly too. I think the major opinion, or at least the team trying to understand, is some of the configuration are specific ambient related. I think we need to understand and drill a little bit more on that. So Jack, maybe you can take a lead, or Keith, if you want to.
Jackie, if you want to let me know, or I can. It's up to you.
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I can share my screen here. Okay, so level setting right quick. I think in the last couple of discussions, we got to good consensus on the shape of the API for service scope, which is good. But one of the things that maybe we didn't talk about as much is how it's going to fit with the existing API, specifically service settings, hosts, and cluster local. So there's been a lot of discussion, as Lynn mentioned. There's been 105 different various comments. So I'm not going to try to regurgitate everything, but and Costin and Lynn, keep me honest here. But it seems like the main point of tension is around whether or not service scope should be, well, a couple of points of contention. And I think there's actually a comment summarizing this. Here we go. Should we have separate APIs for ambient and sidecar? Should service scope be a producer side API or an API affecting clients, what clients talk to? Though a lot of discussion on discoverability, but I think those are the sort of the main two discussion points. Should this be a separate protobuf message? And then should service settings, should service scope be separate in part, like in kind, an implementation from the existing host field? And whether or not we should support host names and wildcards versus label selectors for this work. Thank you. Thank you, Costin. So I'll talk about sort of my perspective for why service scope is sort of designed this way. And we can sort of discuss from there, and folks can keep me honest on implementations and such. So the fundamental reason why my position, at least, is why we should break in the API, not okay, I mean, not use that word, it's a bit of a scary word, why we should create a separate new API with different semantics is because I think that the existing state for sidecar multi-cluster is that we have two different APIs for trying to say the exact same thing. Today in multi-cluster, if you want to expose your service via an east-west gateway, you have to create an Istio gateway resource on that east-west gateway, and then sort of have a host name in that east-west in that Istio gateway resource. Most people put star.local, but you can put, in theory, specific host names, and then expose that's how you expose your services. Separately, if you want to, that only works for multi-network, right? If you want to sort of do something similar for a single network, then you have to go to mesh config and sort of you have to make the service local, and put cluster local to be false. It's a Boolean field that defaults to true, and you have to explicitly set it to false. It's a Boolean input that defaults to false. Cluster local by default is false. You have to set it to true in order to keep your traffic local. Any comments or questions on the current state of the API in Sidecar? Want to make sure we're on the same page there before moving forward.
Just want to add, that's generally what we do for absolutely every API where we have separation between producer APIs and consumer APIs, destination rule versus authorization policy, and so forth. I mean, absolutely everything in Istio and in Kubernetes has this characteristic of separation of concerns between the consumer of a service and producer of a service.
Yes, that's a great point. And so to drill down even further on the service settings, that's a great transition actually. Service settings is a consumer side API. Service settings basically tells the client when you're talking to this service, keep traffic cluster local. Is it not?
I thought it's a producer.
Producers are never impacting the client. I mean, producer settings define policies for the producer. I mean, authorization policy is never informing the client. Whatever the services the server is doing, I mean, client, we may infer from the port on some or IP or whatever, but policies for producer are policies that are enforced, and a producer can never impact the behavior of the client, cannot force a client to send traffic to it. If I expose, it doesn't mean that I can force all clients to send traffic to me unless they have a destination rule or a configuration.
Right, we're not forced. So service settings doesn't force traffic. I'm talking the existing sidecar service settings. The implementation of that for cluster, when you set host to be cluster local, is that the client is not going to send to remote endpoints. We filter non-remote. We filter non-local endpoints. That's what service settings does today.
That's a load balancing policy that is enforced on the client. So client, I mean, the Istio is just basically applying a filter based on whatever client policies are there. But if I in cluster one, in cluster one, all the configurations that are relevant for a workload that is in cluster one are configurations that are in cluster one.
Sure.
No matter.
I'm not disputing that. I'm saying that the service settings field in mesh config is a client-side policy. It's a consumer policy.
It's a destination, equivalent to destination rule. So normally the right place for that would have been in the locality where load balancing that existing destination rule. Why we didn't put it there, it's a different discussion. But that it belongs as an extension to destination rule.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Great. We're on the same page there. It is a service settings today is a client-side policy that filters out endpoints for the client. Great. Okay. So, and to your point about producer-side policy, the current east-west gateway exposure is a producer-side thing, right? You're exposing your services through the east-west gateway. So we've got one producer policy, one consumer policy. We're on the same page there. Awesome. The reason for that my position is that service scope should prefer this is that our service scope should change the status quo is for a couple of reasons. One is because wanting to, as a producer, sitting in the producer side, it's still useful and to some extent desirable, I would say, to be able to mark your service as being not accessible, as to not expose your service to the rest of the mesh or outside of your cluster That is a useful thing, right? In MCS, you can do that with not creating a service export. And regardless of your networking topology, if you don't create a service export, your service is not going to be exposed, right? Yes, well, we do have a producer API, the multi-network, but that's an implementation detail, right? If you only put foo.default.svc cluster.local in that gateway, Istio gateway resource, only that service is going to be exposed to the East-West gateway. So we do have a producer-side API today.
The problem with the API with multi-networks that we had is that we lack the ability to differentiate. So that was really the problem with security CDs that we had, was that because it's based on SNI routing and it doesn't do the double H bond, it lacks the ability to force pretty much anything. It's very easy to bypass so it's not really a policy. It's kind of, as a hack, I don't even know if we document it. We usually just slap the gateway and it forwards everything. We don't really have a way to specify, don't configure all of them.
Right, and that's something that my position is that we should fix. We should fix that. We have double H-bone today. You can apply policy, but we shouldn't be limited by the implementation details of the previous sidecar multi-network. We should move to something better, which is, again, my reason for wanting a different API that is a producer API, and that allows you to sort of, in one step, say, in this cluster, these are the global services, these are the local services. That's what Service Scope does today. We're proposing Service Scope do, rather. Costin, go ahead, and then Louis got his hand up.
No, I just want to say, when I mean policies, I mean authorization policy primarily, because it's not really that you export. Export is really not really relevant. It's basically if you force who can connect to that, including nobody, or not. That's really what double H-bone is doing. You can set, based on all the characteristics of the traffic that are exposed, you can set real policies. The fact that the export is not the important part, but the policy, where you attach policies.
Sure. I think the ability to apply policies at that gateway is useful, but the export, when it comes to a mesh managing things, right? Service export in MCS doesn't change anything about endpoints being exposed or what have you. It's a declarative intent. It's allowing the user to intend that this service is exported to other clusters. So I'll pause there. Louis, you've got a hand, and then Mike's got a hand.
Well, yeah, I think you were about to say the same thing, Keith. All right, the service export in MCS is not a security feature, right? Right, and we should be very clear about that, right? It is a service discovery feature, nothing more. And the same is true here, right? Like, I don't want people to infer that just because traffic goes through an east-west gateway and may or may not be blocked by it, right? The network topology canon will change and endpoints become reachable, right? We should never say anything other than that.
Yes, completely agree. So again, the intent for this API is to give users the ability to declare their intent for whether this endpoint is whether the service is going to be automatically discoverable via Istio. Like, if you want to add coordinates entries, if you want to create a VPN and you can do whatever you want from a network perspective. This API is going to say, what is Istio going to do? And just to make it, sort of go back to the original intent for Service Scope as the new proposed API, Service Scope is meant to say whether you're single network or multi-network, you can declare these service labeling schemes for which services are going to be global. It does get really tricky, right, when it comes to if you've got service scopes that are different across clusters, but we're going to encourage users to not do that, right? It should be consistent because the control plane in the client cluster is going to use its local service scope. But having one API with explicit scopes like global, like local, we can add a regional, we can add things in the future, right? Having an API with strong types versus a single Boolean field not only gives more flexibility, but it allows us to be able to switch the defaults cleanly. But I think what we don't want is and the reason I think there should be a separate API and that Ambient shouldn't support hosts to begin with is because it gets really confusing to have the default be that everything is global in the sidecar and the default be everything is local and ambient with the same API. That gets really tricky and feels error prone and brittle, in my opinion. Mike, you've got a hand, then Costin's got a hand.
Sorry to pull my point in chat. But just trying to clarify that, like, if you were to, like, on a gateway multi-network thing, the gateway is like a barrier bastion of some sort. On a flat network, you could conceivably dial the pod by IP directly, and that's why I think that this is really just like a service discovery question, because, like, if you dial the pod directly, then auth would allow that because we have the same identity for it as the identity in the local cluster for a service by that name. And if this is something we want in auth, that's a different question. I think that, like, I think it is squarely a service discovery question, but it is confusing having it as a consumer policy instead of a producer policy. Like, but and one of the things in the other meeting last week that was brought up was potentially having this, like, scoped as a different resource. Like, I don't think there's a ton of value for introducing something there that is not service export from MCS, but it might be a reason to have that as an alternative implementation instead of like a layer on top of the labels.
So let me. I think we're using different words for different things, and that's the source of most problems here. When we say discoverable and flat network, I think who discovered by who? I mean, Istio will need to watch all the endpoints in all clusters in a flat network, no matter what. So discovery cannot be affected by this API or any other API, because discovery is required for sidecars. If Istio stops discovering the endpoint, we break sidecar. So there is no question that discovery needs to be unchanged no matter what this API is doing. What endpoints are selected, which is load balancing, which is what destination rule is doing, which we already have an API to specify regional or however you want to organize the traffic to be sent. I mean, local, same host even, we can send only to endpoints on the same host, we can send to endpoints on the same network. We can put all kind of configurations that are already supported, and we have a core API, a V1 API that is intended exactly for this purpose. That's what destination rule is doing. I don't know if we need another API that duplicates a subset of destination rule for this particular purpose, maybe. But I want to make sure discovery is kept separate. The feature that we have to use host name, which is critical for cases where you don't control, like, kube system. If Azure or Google is adding some labels or changing the labels in some system application, will be broken if we rely on your labels. And that's why destination rule is also supporting, host names. Anyway, go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, I will weigh in here too. I think we're discussing a lot of implementation detail, which is super interesting. I was just thinking of from a user who is looking at this API, trying to use it. Like the first way when I look at this API, I always think like the service configuration, service setting. I was mostly interpreted as a service owner configuration. As a service owner, I'm defining which of my services I want to be exposed for multi-cluster. So from that perspective, that's how I've been looking at the API. And I don't know if average user will having, a lot of brain sorts, whether this is implemented in destination rule or not, to when they evaluate and using this API. So I do think we'll have to be very, very clear whether this is the service owner or not, which I had always thought is actually for the service owner.
But I think that's a fantastic. Oh, go ahead. I thought you were done. Sorry.
Yeah, I was about to finish, but I do see there's a value as a service consumer side. I can specify maybe not everything I want to consume. So there's a value for that too. But I do think service producer comes first, because service producer has to say, hey, these are the things that I'm actually going to make available for other people to consume. And then on top of that, the service consumer could optionally say, I don't really want to use everything you made it available to me. Sorry, I'm done.
Jackie, you're up.
Jackie,
Oh, yeah.
Which one? Go ahead, Jackie.
Yeah, I guess I just want to make sure I see the docs correctly. I don't see that we document service settings anywhere in our docs, or at least publicly. If you dig into the API repo, you can find the service settings, but I don't think we have any documentation on how to configure hosts or service settings in general. I don't think there is anything exposed there.
Yeah, that's because very few people use it. Yes, we
Okay.
never, and we kind of the intent was to move it to destination rule after we get more feedback, and because it has relatively little usage. But again, that we have a lot of other APIs that are not very well documented.
Okay.
Okay, so just to reply to you, I'm looking at like the service setting line 465 when you propose example YAML. That's how I was looking at.
Yes, but all that's still hidden from docs, I think.
Actually, I do believe the comments you made in the proto is going to surface in the doc, if I'm not mistaken. Because that's how I look at a lot of document, like in the API reference section we have in Istio.io, I do think it surfaced the comments in the proto.
Yes, I think, but I do think in this section it does have the hide from docs label, but I could be wrong. But yes, I agree with you.
Yes, I think go ahead, Lynn.
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't pay attention to hide from docs, but yes, eventually. Go ahead, sorry.
No, yeah, I think you're both correct in that there's no public docs today unless the user goes to the Istio/API repo, is my understanding of the current state. So, Lynn, I think your previous point is spot on, right? I think there's the producer comes first, where we say, I don't want clients from other clusters to be able to call me. That's a producer side action. Consumers should also be able to say, I want to limit the distribution. I want to change the behavior of my data plane and picking different endpoints. And that's where I think that something like destination rule or service settings. In fact, I think most of what you want to do with, in theory, most of what you want to do with service settings is already in destination rule to a point, except that we don't include cluster. We haven't sort of put cluster as a filtering dimension in destination rule today. The ztunnel can do this, actually. The ztunnel protos for WDS have cluster in there, but destination rule and Envoy do not use that as a filtering mechanism. So again, that's an implementation detail, but I do think that we need both. Another one of Lynn's points, it's really easy to look at service settings. If you go and dig deep into the mesh config protobuf and look at the documentation, you think that it's a producer-side API, that the service producer is saying, here's what's local versus not, but it's not. It's a property of what endpoints the client gets. And I think that that's not right. We don't actually have a producer-side API today outside of multi-network and the gateway, at least not that I know of. And that's what service scope is looking to be able to provide, and match the sort of the ethos of MCS and really giving users the ability to get the benefits of MCS and that sort of exporting behavior without having to change their DNS. Louis, you've got a hand?
Yeah, Keith, your definition of a producer-side API seemed a little bit ambiguous in your last statement, right? Like service discovery is a jointly owned thing between the client and the producer, but the producer is the one who, generally speaking, decides which endpoints get populated into any discovery mechanism, or whether the name is discoverable at all, right? That's the producer's choice typically, right?
Intent, an API to serve the producer's intent of global or local. That's maybe that helps.
So generally speaking, that is a producer-side choice. It's possible admins can override it. It's very rare that clients can override it. right? Like who's putting endpoints in DNS today, right?
Right.
It's usually the thing running the job doing that, right? Which is
Right.
producer side intent. And if the producer wants no endpoints, they can remove their job, right? They have absolute control.
Yes.
What the client can do is it can override which endpoints it uses,
Yes. Correct.
right? Which is a load balancing policy choice, right? And it can be very aggressive about how it does that, because it could even resort to alternate discovery mechanisms. But
Yes.
in general, anything that affects the default behavior of discovery in the system is a producer-side API, or at least primarily a producer-side API. So I want to be careful when we say something is not a producer-side API, because most of these APIs are.
I have to disagree with you. In Kubernetes, at least, Istio can do up, or a producer can do absolutely nothing to prevent endpoint to be discoverable, because there is a
Sorry,
pod.
you have to be real careful about what you mean by discoverable versus reachable, Custom.
Discoverer means I can find out that you have a pod with the name foo that has a label XYZ that may or may not have some service, and I can connect to the API server, get all the pods, filter, get the IP address, get the ports, get the full specification. I can discover
So
you.
you can do that only if you have permissions, Custom,
Yeah,
by
Istio
default.
I mean,
No,
that's not,
but remember, Istio infrastructure is not a persona.
okay. Any pod that is in that cluster usually has. I mean, it's very rare to block permission access to pods or to endpoint slices.
Network access, yes, but the ability to read the pod definition is actually typically blocked by default.
A cluster which has RBAC that prevents any pod. I mean, pod and endpoint slices endpoint is usually broadly available in Kubernetes. So, but
Yeah, no, so, right, but like that's still right. You can obviously discover it, right, if you want to go that effort. The real question is what is done for you by default, right? Because the default is the behavior that affects the client the most, because clients are lazy, right? Like that's the intent, right? Clients are usually not trying to work around the discovery limitations, right? So that's still a producer side choice, right? Do I want my service in DNS or not? Do I want to have a service at all, right? Any of those choices.
And in Kubernetes without Istio, that's a pretty clear and well-established pattern. There is no. I mean, you know.
Right, and Istio is largely the same, actually.
Yeah. So with Kubernetes, I mean, at least if you create a service and you have you choose to have the DNS that is VPC is wide, you automatically get a DNS entry. You don't have to do anything. Istio doesn't control the DNS creation because Kubernetes is doing some other control. So our APIs will not impact the discovery because it's something that Kubernetes and the DNS provider is doing, or whatever controller DNS is using.
Right, but even that's producer side, right?
That's infrastructure side. I mean, it's not like
no. Like the producer creates the service resource. The producer decides how they want the service resource to declare the service to DNS.
No, infrastructure, at least in Google, in GCP.
Right. There's the APIs, and then there's what the infrastructure does and how they interact. The APIs are producer side. The service resource lives in the producer namespace, right? It doesn't live somewhere else, right? Generally speaking, again, that's not a hard rule, but it's a typical rule.
Yes, you create a service, at least in GCP, it automatically gets populating in DNS.
But you can opt out if you want.
I don't know. I'm not aware of any way to opt out in GCP. Maybe other vendors have.
So, parking that conversation just slightly, because I actually think Costin's right here. I think being able to opt out might actually violate Kubernetes conformance for the internal service routing. But on the topic of hosts and service settings today, I think, Louis, your point is a good one about producer versus consumer side on that API, and I think it does get money. But I still think the existing API today is effectively consumer, because when you set cluster local for a service, what that says is clients in the cluster governed by this mesh config should only talk to local endpoints for this service. What service scope is doing, or well, ideally what service scope is doing, is it's saying this service is going to be considered. Okay, hold on. In a perfect world, let me start from a perfect world. Start with I wish the API were able to say. In a perfect world, the service settings API would be a producer being able to say, this VIP, the VIP for my service should not be added to service discovery for clients who remote clusters. That's in theory what we want to be able to say. And if all the mesh configs are the same across all clusters, that is the case. If a different cluster wants to export its VIP, then that's fine. Then that's we don't merge labels. If a different cluster wants to export its VIP, that is perfectly acceptable. But with cluster local and service settings today, you don't have that same control. It's not a cluster by cluster decision point. It is clients in my consuming cluster must talk to local endpoints for this service. And I think that still ends up being a consumer side intent, or sorry, a consumer side API.
Well, let's leave aside this. So the second part of what you said was load balancing, Keith, right? Very clearly, right? Clients in the consuming cluster should only talk to local endpoints. That's a load balancing decision.
That's what cluster local and hosts do today. Yes, that's a load. It's a load balancing decision. Well, and it's a endpoint filtering decision. Yes, if you want to say that's load balancing, then yes.
Well, we have hard choices to make about those things, so we're gonna have to be pretty precise about it. The other feature that you want, right, is the ability to control the default horizon for discoverability, right? It doesn't mean that the other endpoints are physically unavailable, right? It just meant that they weren't by default discoverable and therefore not used in load balancing.
From the control plane perspective, or the data plane's perspective, I think that might be the hang-up, right?
Both, right? Because the data plane, right, isn't enforcing authorization policy here. It may enforce a physical boundary, right, at the east-west gateway because that thing was not made routable through the east-west gateway. But if there was another path to the endpoints, then they would be reachable, right? So it's, again, not security. It's just a network bridging and reachability feature.
Correct. And I think on all accounts, right? Like effectively what all these APIs do is filter which endpoints get sent to the data plane. So regardless, the data plane, by default, in the normal Istio case, the data plane is not made aware of these remote endpoints.
Right. So basically, the service producer in the cluster that's going to be consumed remotely is going to say, I want my service to be discovered locally in my cluster this way, load balance locally in my cluster this way, and I want my service to be available or not available under this host name through the east-west gateway.
Yes.
Right. Those are the only physically local things in the cluster that those policies could control in the data plane.
Yes. Yes, I believe. Yes, I think I'm on the same page with you there.
All right, and then the question is, the Istio that's servicing the remote cluster, what visibility does it have? And what choices can it make?
Can we take a step back? I want to go back to something that Jackie said earlier about this API not being visible or not being very well documented. We seem to agree that client decisions are important. And I hope we agree that we have a V1 API that is specifically for this purpose. If I remember correctly, the discussions about the old API, one of the concerns was that it's overlapping with destination rule and user may already have the ability, perhaps more complicated, to do exactly the same thing using destination rule. If we just add, or if the user is just adding the cluster label, like a synthetic label with network we have today, or if the user has one network per cluster, then the network label which you already have serves this purpose. Everything related with the client choice can be done in the V1 destination rule API with no changes whatsoever in API, because we already have locality load balancing, we already have the synthetic labels or the actual labels. It will be confusing for users to have mesh config and destination rule at the same time, because again, there are two APIs doing exactly the same thing in different ways. So let's keep, for people who want to have client side, keep using destination rule to control where the traffic go. Let's add the destination rule, the cluster local, or make it improved, document better, or whatever is necessary, and have a separate API for whatever you want to do about exposing east-west gateways for whatever, if they exist, because there will be users who will just do L4 with no waypoints and just rely on L4 policies.
Okay, so now we're getting to brass tacks, and this is good because we got 15 minutes left in this meeting. So core problem statements for what we need in ambient multi-cluster today. Today, we don't have a way for exposing services to the east-west gateway. The existing API in V1 is Istio gateway resource. We don't want to use that. In gateway API doesn't have a standard route for it. So we need an answer there, just sort of laying out the problems.
That's not true. I mean, for waypoints, we don't have an API to expose services to waypoint. It's automatic.
And we have a label. We have a label selector. Use waypoint. That's how. Even for routing everything else, you have to have use waypoint in order for the waypoint to be fronted for that service to take that role. We need a similar thing, some glue, to associate a service to an east-west gateway.
Debatable. I mean, so far people have used multi-network for years, and they seem to be okay with the existing automatic. I mean, yes, they cannot enforce policies strongly because it's SNI routing, but I haven't heard anyone complain really about it. I mean, it's mostly the fact that you like the feature, but it's if people are okay with the current multi-network in Istio V1, which is basically exposing all services in the mesh, which is reasonable.
Well, it's not. That's the thing. I have to sort of be stickler for that. It's not doing it automatically. There is an API. There is a declarative intent to the gateway resource. You can, yes, there's a star.local in the Istio gateway resource that does the exposition, that does that exporting.
Per service. You just do it once, and then all services in that cluster are exposed.
Yes, that's how it works today, but there's still some intent, right? There is still some intent. We don't have an analog today, right? We don't have an analog for that today. So we need to solve, we need that. The other thing we need, right, is I think in ambient we can do better than we do in sidecar. So we want to probably have that same intent for single network, where the user says this thing is global versus local. And today that's sort of not really can be done with service settings. But again, that's a consumer side API where this is producer side intent. And so for those reasons, I think we need the service scope API. But I think the main question here now is should this be in service settings or should this be a separate API? And then should this work for ambient and sidecar? Should this be ambient? So I think those are the brass tacks behind this API. It sounds like we're starting to approach some consensus that we need both consumer and producer side APIs. And we've talked in previous weeks that service scope is a good producer side API. I think now is the main question is, do we continue to support hosts and cluster local for ambient? And then should service scope apply to sidecar? Yeah, Louis, go ahead.
So I just want to be clear on what features we actually want. So we have a single control plane, right? And then kind of federated control plane models, right? Right. So the assumption with Istio D viewing multiple clusters was it was uniform discovery across all things, right? By sharing a control plane. And it was somewhat irrelevant whether it was single network or multi-network because the control plane was a uniform place for service discovery. It sounds like what we're saying is we want split horizon DNS, right, to partition discoverability of names, right, which is what MCS did. Right? MCS was designed in theory to say different clusters would get different views of the endpoints based on what they federated with each other, right, via the service import and service export APIs. That was not a feature that we've supported historically, but it is a feature that we could support. Right, and people can do that manually using workload entry and service entry today, right, by partitioning that way. So we have to decide if we want to add that feature. Because that seems to be implicit in some of this discussion that we're trying to provide partitioned discovery, which is totally separate from load balancing, right? And is more aligned with a federated approach, or at least looks like it's more aligned with the federated approach, even if and then we have a decision if we want to do that within single control plane or not. We can achieve it today with service entry and workload entry.
I think the main debate about this API is not about adding a new feature. I don't think anyone said no to a new feature in Istio. The problem is with not supporting the existing behavior of Istio, which is the simple, all services are globally available. by default, you can specify with destination rule or with locality load balancing or with this told the mesh config API. Using the host name, you can specify its cluster local. That's a feature that existing users have. It works relatively well. It has been used for years. This API is removing that. That's my concern, and it's changing the semantics of that. If you just add a new API, a new feature, go for it. No problem. You can add any API you want. If you don't break existing users and the ability to again.
Right. So I would agree with Costin that we absolutely have to have a way to specify a default, which is cluster.local is globally visible across all clusters.
That's no problem.
Still the case with this. That's still the case with this API, by the way. Like this API does not change cluster.local from being globally visible. This gives the user a way, like gives different cluster producers or producers across different clusters ways to say whether or not this particular instance, these instances of a service are going to be a part of that cluster.local pool. And to Louis' point, that is a new partitioning thing. The last thing I'll say is that I push back a little bit, Costin. Nobody's using this API for ambient today. Like I want to be really clear about that. Like nobody's using this cluster local host API with ambient today.
They're using it with sidecars perfectly fine. So if ambient just keeps exactly the same behavior as sidecars with the exact same API, I don't think there is a problem with that. It's actually good because users have an easier time migrate. They don't have to learn a new thing. It's always good to keep the behavior of all the APIs and all the installations and not have to do anything to migrate to ambient.
Well, to be clear, that's not been our stance in the past, right? We've broken that many times. We don't support on-by filter. We don't support wildcard service entry in ambient. Like every time we talk about supporting a new interaction UX in ambient, we take, rightfully so, I think we take the opportunity to re-examine user experience in the API and determine whether or not it's worth keeping. I think we're in that same decision point today, right? We're deciding whether or not we take forward this API or adopt a new API or support both, right? That's the decision point that we're at today. And I think all options are somewhat on the table.
But I haven't heard any reason why selecting by hostname needs to be taken out or is wrong. What is wrong with it? I mean, avoid filter, we know why we took them out. Other things we know why, but you are just saying, hey, we have this new API, let's get rid of the host name with no justification and no replacement. Because again, if you don't have control over the service labels, like your system, host name is the only thing that works.
That's on purpose, though. Like if you don't have control of Kube's system, you shouldn't be exporting that service globally. That's by design.
Well, depends on what you are doing. I mean, it's not the control over the labels on other clusters is usually not the same with control over the. So you are saying basically that we don't want to support host names because what? I mean, what is wrong with it?
I don't have a ton of. To be clear, I'm not against supporting host names. What I'm saying is, if we want to add a host name field to service scope, I think that's fine. My issue is the service settings API generally is insufficient, I think, for what we want to express as a producer side API in ambient. If you want to add host name selection as another modality of service scope, that's a different conversation. Off the top of my head, I think my concern with that is that a mesh admin without any sort of buy-in from the producer, service producer, can now just like expose the service. And I think that's potentially concerning. I take your point on Kube system. Maybe the mesh admin wants to control like GKE's Kube system or expose AKS's stuff in Kube system for some reason. And we can talk about those interactions. I think Tyler last week in the meeting had a good case for why a mesh admin might want to expose things regardless of the service producer. I think we can have that conversation. But I think that's an N+1 discussion from the existing labeling API, which makes sense with the current semantics that we're seeing in MCS as well as Gateway API with service ownership.
Okay, I want to be very clear. There is no discussion about whether we can control or not control if a service is exposed. It is a decision by the network infrastructure, and that's it. Because
I negative one to that. I'm sorry. I think exposing a service is a producer, and Louis said at the beginning, right? It's a producer side decision of whether my service is going to be global or not. Like that is a function of the service owner, likely in collaboration with the mesh admin, but you can't just you assume that the producer is going to be left, the service owner is going to be left out of that decision making.
That's how it works in GCP or in any network that has shared VPC. On shared VPC, again, with managed DNS, that's how it works, and I don't think there is any API in Kubernetes that will prevent that because it's breaking. I don't want to give users the illusion that they can.
So it occurs to me that we can rely on an age-old open source project adage here. Costin, you're arguing for a second API for service exposure. And the open source adage is, of course, pull requests welcome. I don't think that anyone is suggesting that that second API is a prerequisite for offering multi-cluster support in ambient, that we must have that API in order to say that we support multi-cluster. We've got one API to do that operation. We can add a second one if you all would like to submit a pull request. I think we do have some concerns with that, and whether that follows our the model that we're trying to build here in terms of user personas. But that I don't want to couple these two conversations. We need an API for service exposure. I think we all agree on one of them. Let's break the second one off into a secondary discussion and see where it goes.
So my point is, I don't want to break the existing API. If you want to add a new API to do whatever service exposure, like service export is doing that already, but whatever new API, and I have no problem with that. My concern with this API is that it's changing the semantics and is removing features from the old world where you could use hostname and you could use the cluster. It was the cluster, a consumer API.
Louis?
Just so we're all clear on what we're trying to achieve. So I'm okay with the idea of ambient at the admin level, switching by default to an opt-in for global discovery, right? As opposed to an opt-out, which we didn't really even have with Sidecar. Like that type of change, I think we're all fine with it, right? As long as the admin can make that choice at install time, we're good, so they can maintain the existing behavior. What we're trying to achieve then is an opt-in discovery model in a multi-cluster scenario so that people don't footgun themselves, essentially, by making things globally available that they didn't mean to be frequently consumed. It's not a security feature, right? It's a footgun protection thing. It can, in conjunction with other facilities, be turned into a security feature. Right? If this desired security property is, I do not want the existence of this thing to be known, right? That's the security property we're talking about in another cluster via, at least DNS. I'm not going to say we're providing strong guarantees about it not being knowable by 17 other mechanisms, but at least that one, it is not knowable. As Costin rightly points out, if you're using DNS infrastructure that's built into the VPC mechanism, they tend not to do split horizon very well. And so your mileage is going to vary based on that property. So it's primarily about the first thing, right? No fuck guns, right? Consuming services that were not meant to be consumed across cluster boundaries and moving to an opt-in model for that, because that's really how people should deal with things, right? That's what we're saying. And then it's what's the least API churn that's going to get us to that place that is the least ambiguous. Is there any other functional requirement?
Exposing through the east-west gateway and ambient today is the other one.
That's
yes.
an implementation detail of the functional requirement, Keith, right?
Well, I mean, stated differently, there has to be some mechanism to expose
Yeah,
the
sure.
east-west gateway. That's what I want to make sure is covered, and this would solve that.
If we're going to say that service discovery is coupled with service communication, right, and that if something is discoverable, it's generally communicatable with, right, which is what we try to achieve. We don't try not to expose things that are unreachable. Then yes.
Speaking of implementation, it's a double-edged one. It's a great implementation, but technically everything we want to do for ambient that Louis described can be done with absolutely zero change in the API surface by just supporting the existing API. And then, as Mitch was saying, add more APIs to control whatever other things we want to control. fine tune or
Well, I don't know,
That's not
Costin, if we have
true.
a good API experience for saying, one, this is opt-in, and then two, what the opt-in is. Because right now, in the default model today in Sidecar, everything is opted in by default, and there's really no way to opt out
So
for
we can
discoverability, right? Which means I can't meet the property of I don't want you to know this thing exists.
that's an API for discovery. But what I'm saying is today we can just say in ambient default is local by default, and then you use the existing APIs, either destination rule or the mesh config with the host names, to explicitly opt in the services that you want to have global. Which
Mesh
is,
config
again,
does not go to ztunnel, so that would be new implementation.
that implementation is not new API. So the API that exists today can be implemented by Istio by sending more endpoints for the opted in. I mean, it's just code, not API change.
How do you change the default? It is an API change because you're changing the default for ambient specifically to now be local by default instead of global by default. And so you're making a single bool field have a different default depending on ambient versus sidecar.
So you are changing the documentation of the API specified in ambient, which we already have. We already say that in ambient the default is local. That we already documented. What we are
We don't have
adding,
multi-cluster today, so I don't know where we document that, but sure.
that's by definition. I mean, if we don't have multi-cluster, it's local by default. So the current ambient is local by default. So we are adding an ability to opt in some services to be global by adding. Well, let me rephrase. Let me correct myself because I'm wrong. We are not with workload entry, which is supported. We do support multi-cluster today. It is just the manual mode of multi-cluster. But workload entry and the old mechanism, original mechanism of multi-cluster remains supported in ambient. It works.
I would.
So Keith,
Go ahead,
just
Louis.
on that transition, right? On the transition from from single cluster to multi-cluster with ambient, right? Because obviously we're adding that feature. I think Costin's right that when in a world where you go from single cluster ambient to multi-cluster ambient, and if we had local default, right? So things locally only talk locally. When you add multi-cluster, the risk that we ran with Sidecar was that traffic that was local now becomes global by default without you opting into anything, right? And that was disruptive for people. That was Sidecar users got over that. But it should be opt-in. Now it can be opt-in at the admin level, right? So they can say, look, I want not just local by default, but I want mesh wide by default, right? We have to have some way to say that, right? Because we don't want to. But I think Costin's right that the existing default of the cluster, because the users are already local, anything we do on top of that is technically additive.
Sure. Okay, sure. I think I'll rephrase my point then to say it's an API smell and a code smell to have a single field mean different things in different contexts, have different defaults in different contexts, especially when it's a bool field.
I think the Boolean field is a disaster, right? And if we can move away from it, we should. So Costin, I'm not arguing that we should retain terrible APIs here.
No, Boolean. I mean, the API has a list of host names and cluster local true or false. There is no
bool field. that's a bool field.
It's a bool field, but which is very clear. I mean, it remains the same. Nothing changes in the bool field. If you say true, it's global. If you say this straight true,
no, but it does sound insufficient, Costin, right? If what people want is topological control.
Okay, that's the
so we should revisit that. We can leave the old API in place. The Boolean just means global or not, and there should be a revision to the API to add something in between. And we can look at the schema for it.
Use only destination rule, which is also working.
Okay, we're out of time for today's meetings. I think what we have agreed on is we should not. I'm not quite convinced of this because I'm concerned about two different APIs, but it sounds like we want to retain the ability, maybe outside destination rule, to have a client keep its traffic local. We want to maintain the capability that we had in the previous sidecar API. We want to additionally have a way for producers to mark their services as global versus local. And we want that default for ambient to be local. So I don't to be clear, I don't think this changes anything about the existing API except maybe the existing PR, except documentation. I think the only documentation is we're not going to say only hosts versus only service settings or service scope. Only one of hosts versus service scope has to be defined because they're actually, as we discussed it, they're actually different implementations, different meanings, and we can sort of discuss the interaction between the two. But I don't hear. Correct me if I'm wrong. While we're as we finish up here, I don't hear anything blocking the existing PR outside of documentation. Is that, and maybe we can just hide from docs for now. But it sounds like we want both APIs.
No. There is also block. I mean, so I said, if you wanted consumer API, it's right place. If you want the producer API, different proto. I mean, I don't want to confuse users of this. So put a different proto if you want the new API, like Mitch was saying, just completely different, and leave the old one in place, basically.
Okay, that's a fair comment. So if
you want the client side, then you can just add the better names than the cluster local true false. I mean, if you want to add more explicit, but
so plan is refactor or make some change, revisit the host API, this for service settings, make service scope a separate API, and then we can maybe iterate towards a harmonious interaction between the two and explain that for users. Does that sound like a plan that we're on board with? Okay,
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, should we wrap this up? Thanks everyone for the great discussion today.
One quick thing as we wrap up, that multi-cluster doc. Keith, sorry, did you just touch on this? I'm switching tabs too quickly.
I didn't get a chance to.
Yeah, so I've dropped a reminder in the TOC channel. The multi-cluster doc has not changed substantially in 4 weeks. We have 3 sign-offs on it. We're waiting for, I think, Lynn and Louis. So if you could try to prioritize that as soon as possible. It's been in review since January.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thank you.
Thanks for the reminder.
Yep.
Thanks, folks.
All right,
See you later.
thanks everyone. Bye.